Let's start with the lady in the red top over there, and then we'll have the gentleman in the front row here, and then the gentleman in that corner there.
Hi, Laurie Heber-Girardet from OCHA. So my question is, what are the very practical steps that you see the international community needing to take in order to lead the way on this transformation? I know from the work that we're doing already in multiple contexts that there's a real dearth of skilled capacity right now to do cash programming. There aren't enough people in the system who actually have the skills to do it. We're challenged to find people who can coordinate cash. So I'm wondering, what are the very practical steps, and what are the resources that donors are willing to put behind this transformation that's required across the system? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. To this gentleman here.
Thank you. My name's Malcolm Harper. Sort of the obverse of that question in a way. A statement first. I'm a recipient of cash transfer, and it's called a pension. And that was largely earned by working in the aid trade, and I suspect I'm not alone in this room. To what extent is resistance to a movement to transfer cash transfers the result of people like me, at least until recently, being reluctant to lose their jobs? Or putting it in another way, what are the aid trader employment implications of a massive move to cash transfers? Another quite separate question relating to work I actually do myself now. Are there any experiences, views on how young children must, or how old they must be before they can be suitable recipients of cash transfers? I do a lot of work with children in India. I just want to know how, to what extent one can look at cash transfers for them. Thank you.
Thanks, Malcolm. Let's get one more in the bag, and then we'll get some answers to gentlemen.
Hi, this is Jeremy Shoham from the Emergency Nutrition Network. I want to follow up on a question related to Rachel's presentation. We heard a number of speakers talk about the need for non-conditional cash transfers. And I have a question about the extent to which the high-level panel reflected on conditional cash transfers. We also heard that the hope is that humanitarian cash transfers can ultimately or ideally be piggybacked onto social protection programs. Yet a lot of these social protection programs have conditional elements, trying to increase uptake of health services or improve nutrition knowledge, that sort of thing. So my question is, how do we reconcile these two different or competing views about conditionality?
Okay, thanks for all those questions. Because that last one, I think, was specific to Rachel. Rachel, would you like to start by answering that question about conditionality? Use this microphone. Actually, why don't you use that one?
Thanks. Conditional versus unconditional is the hot potato debate in social protection. And I think what you've got to ask yourself is why we plump for conditional. There's not really any good evidence that people make better expenditure decisions, that they make better choices about what they do when conditions are imposed on them. And a lot of concern that imposing a condition is imposing a tax. So if you're going to ask somebody to go to the health centre once a month in order to receive their benefits, then they have to walk to the health centre, that takes them a day. They have to queue up, that takes them a day. They have to walk home, that takes them a day. They've lost 3 days' labour. So major concerns about tax. But what we do know is that within government-run or government-supported programs, the conditions can be important for political acceptability, for people to be willing to pay taxes to pay for programs. And so I think the challenge for trying to reconcile an emergency response with a long-term social protection response and this question of conditions is really about navigating the relationship with government again. And I don't know any examples of where conditions have been taken away. But I do know that there are examples of people doing conditional labour in order to do things that improve the situation in their communities. So it's really about people's reactions to those conditions, and also about the kinds of dialogue that humanitarian actors want to have with governments, and whether they're willing to challenge but risk undermining the political acceptability of those programs.
The question that came from Malcolm, the cash transfer recipient. You talked about resistance to cash. What were the employment implications of a move to yes, for the aid industry, let's say? And also, how old does somebody need to be suitable recipient of cash transfers? Dagan, are these questions that you think you can take on, given your experience of this in the past? You can use my mic.
I think, yes, I'm not a very good diplomat. I'm not Klaus. So I'll leave the diplomacy for Klaus. I think there are vested interests, and I think that this transformative vision that I've talked about does imply that there will have to be a radical change in the current structure. And a lot of people, there will be concerns around relevance. Are you still relevant as an agency? And already, before we even got to that vision, there were concerns because the likes of WFP has a very sophisticated infrastructure logistics team that moves food. Now within WFP to hit the target about 30%, I think that was their global target to reach 30%, it means that they have to now let go of all those logistics people and hire all these cash experts that the lady from OCHA was talking about, people who, and there aren't that many of them, you know, market experts, people in finance and all of that. So there are serious consideration about your staffing structure. But even more radically, there are serious considerations and conversations that have to be taken place about relevance of some of these big agencies that function very well within their specific silos. And if we say now UNHCR, if any time a displacement happens, you're the only one agency that will register all people and put them into some kind of digital payment mechanism, and everybody goes now to the market. You know, the market starts supplying food, the market starts supplying shelter, you rent from the local market in terms of your shelter needs. Of course, not everything will be of the quality that we want, but if there's money to be paid, then maybe the market will start responding. So what do you do as an agency that provides shelter? What do you do as an agency that provides health services? So there are some serious questions, I think, around those. The question around children, in a humanitarian setting, when you're giving out cash transfers, there is no cutoff age. So you look at vulnerability, and oftentimes families with a large number of children are some of the targeting criteria that you would use to give priority to those households with children.
Thanks, Dagan. Owen, I just want, as the chair of the panel, I just want you to answer this question as well about the implications for the current aid system of your recommendations. You've thought about that in the panel's work.
We haven't. Is this on? No? Yes. So we did talk about this, both about the question of what the implications would be for existing organisations and this rather hard question of how we accelerate change. Perhaps I'm naively Tiggerish in saying this, but I actually rather disagree with the tone of the thought that individuals working in humanitarian aid would, out of interest for their own job or pension, resist a shift to cash if the evidence and experience suggests that that is better. And I'm sure, Malcolm, that's, well, perhaps, I guess that's not what you were suggesting. I think it's a question of organizational and institutional dynamics more than individual resistance to change. There are a lot of people working in the international system who want to see this change, but are working in institutions whose mandates and structure is not well set up to enable them to deliver that. And it's organizations more than individuals that need to change here. I suppose my one qualification on that would be that there are often people working in the system who have strong priors and beliefs themselves about what's important and what works in international development, and make it their life's mission to deliver that thing, and find it very difficult to be told that actually it really shouldn't be their choice. It should be the choice of somebody else, of the beneficiary. But I think by and large the question here is how we bring about institutional change. And that's very difficult in this system. And the panel's recommendations, recommendations 9 to 12 especially, are designed to say, well, we're not going to set an overall target for how much aid should be delivered as cash. What we're going to do instead is try and recommend some specific changes that we think would bring about a change in the dynamics in the system. And the most important of those is that we make cash a central part of each humanitarian appeal. And then we need donors to step up to the plate and say they are willing to back the use of cash transfers in these situations. Now, I do think that as you see that dynamic emerge, as you see well-funded appeals for cash transfers, then you will begin to see international aid agencies beginning to put together mechanisms for delivering those cash transfers. And what we want to see is a certain amount of competition and testing of ideas. We don't know yet what works in all circumstances. The evidence we've got so far on cash transfers is good, but they're still rather limited in scope. And we need to do more of these things. We need to find out, and David Miliband was exactly right in his video message to call for more testing and learning. So we want to see organizations. I don't buy the idea that there aren't enough people out there who can do cash transfers. I mean, frankly, it isn't rocket science. There's a huge private sector capacity in delivery of cash. And increasing the NGO delivery. And I think aid agencies can turn to those and should turn to those, shouldn't be trying to reproduce those skills in-house. And what it means, I think, for humanitarian agencies is a rather positive message, which is things that they should be doing. The work they do on targeting, the work they do on monitoring, the work they do as bearing witness, témoignage, as they say in Médecins Sans Frontières, is an important part of the humanitarian effort. That is a more important function than running logistics of warehouses of food, actually. So I think there are huge opportunities for people who work in humanitarian aid to shift to what they ought to be doing, rather than doing something that they aren't doing all that well, when there are real experts who can do that well, and which would make a real difference to a bigger difference to people's lives.
Okay, I think you started to touch on a couple of elements of Laura from Ocha's question.
I was trying to cover them both.
Okay, excellent, good. Do you want to just maybe you could pick up on the other part of that question about addressing the dearth of skills?
I thought I did, which is I don't buy it.
I love the brevity of that. Okay, Michael Fay, you wanted to make a point there. Pass the microphone over.
I'll just add one thing which Owen alluded to earlier, which is if we incent the NGOs and operating partners on outcomes and have clear metrics by which to measure them. And that could be as simple as how much of this dollar we're giving you winds up in the hands of the poor. The simplest of questions, which we have the hardest of times answering. If we had those, to Deegan's earlier point, people will respond. We will get folks trained in cash, NGOs will swarm into cash. But I think we need to understand what the bogey that we're trying to hit is, and incent on outcomes and not inputs.
Michael, thank you. Let's go to one of the questions we're getting from our online audience. Hélène Jouillard, who's an independent consultant joining us from Paris. She asks, should our agenda be to advocate and build evidence for more at-scale cash transfer programs? Or should we push for more market-based programming, which embed cash transfer programs, but also include supporting market actors and strengthening access to market for the poorest or most affected? Got that, Klaus? Let me get you to answer. Use my mic.
Well, it actually links up to what I wanted to have said just a moment ago about people being squeezed out of traditional jobs inside agencies and having to master other techniques. Because if we inject cash and there's not a market, the goodies are not coming, then of course we need analysts to help us to see what can be done to overcome the bottlenecks. And a lot can be done there by actually, if you take a logistician from the World Food Programme, they are very good at moving lorries, but they can actually also do a lot in telling us how the market for transport works and why are the costs suddenly peaking when we inject cash, etc. So there's scope. There's a simple fact. If any organization changes at a slower speed than the surrounding world, then it's condemned to die. So watch out, it's coming. One of the things that are coming very fast are metrics, and the fact that we can measure much better and that we can capture in databases information directly from the beneficiaries. It just can go straight up. And I think this global dashboard idea is something we would come back to also in Istanbul. And that would put a lot of pressure on all of us, and we better change.
Klaus, thank you. Let's take another question from our online audience. This comes from Aslan Noakes, who's the executive director and co-founder of Empower Haiti Together. He's joining us from Oregon in the US. Quite an early morning, Aslan. Thank you for joining us. His question, could the panel comment on cash transfers to places like Haiti, considering the transfer fees and dangers of carrying cash out of banks? Michael, do you have an answer to that?
Sure. So we haven't done Haiti yet, but have been looking at it. And I think I'll start with a stat on Haiti, which is for the amount of money we spent over the recent disaster, we could have given each Haitian about $1,000, which is more than the GDP per capita of each Haitian. So the bar we've set for ourselves is pretty low in Haiti. We could have doubled GDP in essence. I think you're right that Haiti has struggled with mobile money on many dimensions, and not just the fees, but on the coverage of agent networks. The only thing I would say there is that as we think about the mobile operators and the fees involved, we should be careful not to compare explicit fees from mobile operators with the hidden fees of the sector. And those are fees that don't get reported in a number like 8% per mobile transfer, or whatever the case may be. I'm optimistic for Haiti, but we haven't done direct work there yet.
Let me just ask you to pick up on that point about transfer fees in the experience that your organisation had in Somalia. How much of an obstacle was that, and the danger of actually handling cash, the insecurity of it? Talk to us about that.
Actually, there has been numerous studies and evidence shown that that the cost of actually transferring a 50 kilo bag of maize to a beneficiary in Somalia or other parts of Africa is, I think, anywhere between 20 to 30, 40%. There's different studies that show different amounts, more expensive than transferring a $100 note or $50 note. Our experience has been that actually our transfer fees are actually very low. We pay anywhere between 5 to 8%. Depending on insecurity. So the more insecure the area is, we pay a higher transfer cost to the money transfer companies. This cost eventually will reduce because of market competition. Now, as more and more NGOs are getting into this market and using the money transfer companies, they're actively competing for business, and they're actively reducing their cost. So in 2007, 2008, in Lower Juba, the cost was as high as 10%. Now in Lower Juba, the cost is getting down to 5 or 6% because the money transfer companies see that there's competition. So again, the market is responding and all of that. So I think even further, we will, now that we are looking at mobile money, people talk about Kenya. Kenya was the first, but M-Pesa has taken off, or the equivalent of M-Pesa has taken off dramatically in Somalia in far larger scale. So now with mobile money payments, I think the cost will reduce even more significantly.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm getting the sense that there are plenty more questions in the room. Am I right in that? Hands up if you want to ask a question. I ask because we are coming close to the time we were supposed to finish, but I'm going to suggest that we run a little bit long if people are happy to stay. If you want to leave, then please feel free to do so. But we urge you, and those of you watching online, to carry on engaging in the conversation. Let's get some questions from this side. There's a gentleman in the front with the IRC badge, and then the two women in the row behind.
Thank you. San Shrikanthan, Director of Policy and Practice with the International Rescue Committee. Just drawing together a few comments from the panel. Firstly, the recommendation that why not cash? Secondly, Degan's experiences where there was a reluctance to use cash, even though it proved to be effective. And lastly, the fact that we know we work in a sector that yields really slowly to any sort of change unless it's thrust upon them. Why not think about an operational bottom-up change where in L3 emergencies, donors are forcing a percentage of funding, say through multilateral channels or any others, to be used in cash programming, where we can, as David Miliband has also said, we can test and learn from this. Yes, not every experience will be perfect, but there's a dearth of impact evaluations in humanitarian settings anyway, and even less in cash. And we only learn by doing. And therefore, unless you set that target, we won't see NGOs, and I think Degan's quite right, NGOs will run to the money, take up the challenge. Without it, I think they will go for less risk-averse solutions. So why not cash as a earmarked amount? Doesn't need to be a lot that can be used to test and learn the use of cash in emergencies. Thank you.
I just wondered if any of you, sorry, my name is Kate Newton, Humanitarian Advisor on the Syria crisis from DFID. I just wondered if you're able to, if you have any thoughts about the link between cash transfers and resilience, because a lot of the work that we're doing in the current humanitarian world is looking at the linkages between humanitarian resilience development and there's quite a strong case at the moment for stating that cash transfers contribute to resilience. So I just wondered if you have any thoughts on that, because I found that, apart from the obvious benefits on markets, etc., I think that's quite a difficult link to make if it's just a transfer and there's no conditions attached to it. And so just any thoughts you might have on that.
Okay, and then the woman next to you. Yeah.
Hi, Carmen Samadiviria from Médecins Sans Frontières. I was just wondering how much work the panel has done on fragile and conflict-affected states, and because a few panelists have actually mentioned working in the most difficult places, do the markets respond, and how and what was the panel's experience on that? Thanks.
Okay, great. 3 good questions there. Let's start with the first one from the gentleman from IRC. Klaus, I think this probably is for you again, as a spokesman for the headless chickens, as you just called it. Why don't donors force cash transfers? Well, there's a microphone to your right.
Well, if we take the Syrian crisis, we have actually, over the last 3 years, put an increasing pressure on the agencies to join up on cash transfers to create common joint plastic cards where the assistance coming from different agencies were actually put on the same plastic card. And we have maybe not said that 50% of the assistance should be in the form of cash, but it has been part of all the conversations. So I think we could perhaps push it a little bit further and say that next time we have an L3, we can set a target. Now, this being said, it all depends on context. If you go to the Central African Republic, where you had a total breakdown of markets, where, I mean, there were serious protection issues and so on and so forth, a lot of the money had to go to other types of delivery that could not easily be brought forward by the market. And I'm saying something that maybe I shouldn't say. The biggest thing was to provide security, actually, because without security, even MSF were threatening with pulling out. So it all depends on the context, but in certain cases, we can definitely push it.
I think you sort of responded to the question from the lady from MSF there as well about in fragile states, especially, do markets respond? Degan, is that something that you have, something that you can add to as well?
I mean, outside of the Syria conflict, and I don't know what a better fragile state than there is in Somalia, where you've had a conflict for over 20 years, and you've had an active conflict with Al-Shabaab in the south, and we distributed over $80 million in the south, and the markets responded, and responded amazingly. So this was one of the concerns that we had with the donors, and was trying to convince them that actually the markets, the Somalis are very entrepreneurial, and even if there's a blockade here because of fighting, they will find a way to go around that, and they did. They used Ethiopia, so they would go from Ethiopia and bring the goods into Somalia. So, you know, I think the traders will respond. I strongly believe in that. I just wanted to mention something about resilience and respond to this issue of resilience. Cash is not a solution to everything, and I think everybody tries to find, you know, direct linkages between cash and various problems. But I do believe that if we are quick in our response and we start thinking about pre-positioning, and in the world of today, we pre-position food globally, but we don't think about pre-positioning data. Imagine if we have all beneficiaries registered all over the world in these 91 countries that WFP works in, and all that information is already in a database. Then I think if you do respond very quickly, the household is less likely to get into distress coping mechanism and sell all their livestocks and make a difficult decision like trekking to Dadaab and crossing crossing 1,000 kilometers rather than staying where you are because you're going to receive a predictable transfer over a 6-month or a year period. I think if people had information and could plan, they would make different decisions. So that is part of creating a stronger resilience. And I would also like to say that one of the things that we have seen repeatedly, at least in pastoral settings and even in farming communities, is that people use money not just for food, but they also use it to repay back debt. And why is that debt important? Because that credit system allows them to cope during a crises by getting access to that credit from a trader. And if they pay that trader back when they get a cash in their hands from an aid agency, then after that agency leaves, they can have access to that credit. So people are making very long-term, sophisticated decisions about access to that credit rather than just buying food immediately, which is what you would think your knee-jerk reaction would be, that they would immediately fill their stomachs and buy food. So my point about that is that people are very capable to make very interesting and complicated decisions.
And Deng, let's just hammer home this point, because you were telling me this earlier when we were speaking about this. In your experience in Somalia, when the cash transfers were given to people, they didn't waste the money. They didn't squander it. The knee-jerk reaction might be that they might spend it on alcohol, drugs, guns, whatever. But you didn't find that, did you?
We have not found in over 10 years any incident of money being used for an antisocial behavior. Not in 10 years. No, we have not. We have not seen any incidences of conflict between households where a wife said that the husband misused the money, ran off, and did something bad with it. We have not seen any such incidents. And we did see one incident or two, I'm trying to remember from our post-distribution data, where a beneficiary complained to the committee about her husband potentially misusing the money, and the committee intervened and told Adesso, change the registration and give the money to the wife instead of the husband. But that is just so uncommon. I think it was like 2 or 3 cases over 10 years. So this notion that people are irresponsible is very paternalistic, and it has to stop.
Thank you. Malcolm, did you spend your cash transfers as responsibly? I wonder. Rhetorical question. Rachel, do you want to respond to the question about resilience, cash transfers, and the link with resilience?
Yeah, if I may, just a really quick example of fragility. So we always talk about the conflict stuff, but we don't always talk about the fragility bit that isn't related to conflict. A really good example from Zimbabwe of providing cash transfers. Now, you'd think Zimbabwe was the worst place in the world to give somebody a cash transfer with the rate at which inflation runs. If you give someone a cash transfer in Zimbabwe, they immediately go and buy vegetable oil, which the next day is worth twice as much as it was the day before, and 2 days later is worth more and more and more. So just like countries in the north invest in gold when their currency is looking a bit shaky, they invest in vegetable oil or something that will hold its value. And so there are all sorts of ways in which people are clever enough to do the right thing, even in difficult circumstances. On resilience, I have very strong feelings that we load up cash transfer programs particularly, and lots of other social protection programs too, with too many objectives. And I think that the best approach to trying to get resilience as a secondary objective of a cash transfer program is by keeping it simple and doing it well. So don't worry about whether you're linking it to all sorts of other kinds of programs. Deliver the money, a reasonable amount, on time, when you said you would. Because it's the reliability that enables people to predict, to be able to not sell off assets when they get into trouble. The reliability allows people to access credit that they wouldn't otherwise get, that can shore them up in difficult times. But most of all, reliability means that resilience from cash transfers is that it is there to fall back on. Not that it changes the rest of your life, that you are being taken care of in a difficult time. And I think people miss that bit of resilience. And for me, that's what it should be about with cash transfers.
Okay, right, Rachel, if you could pass the mic to Michael. This question is to you, Michael. This comes from Malcolm Johnston, who also works for IRC. Goodness, I hope you people are actually doing some work today, not just stopping. Well, we're glad that you're stopping everything to kind of watch this panel. I'm sure you're not. Malcolm Johnson is in IRC in Lebanon. Michael, he says, finding the right people to give money to is pretty difficult to do fast and accurately in some situations and takes a lot of resources. How would you find the poor / the vulnerable on an individual basis quickly in a disaster situation to target for instant cash transfers?
You've asked one of the toughest questions of humanitarian aid and development. I've got about a minute to answer it. No, this is the targeting question, and I think it's core not just to cash programming, but whatever type of programming, which is how do we choose whom to give to and whom not to give to. And I think there are trade-offs involved. There are more costly, time-consuming methods that could potentially find the even poorer folks. And there are the quicker methods that we need to sometimes do because of necessity. I think there's a lot of exciting work, everything ranging from big data to some of the stuff we've been doing at Give Directly, where you can use satellite imagery to map people's plots and both see things like the size and the type of housing construction that you can use to target. But you could also imagine with things like GPS after an earthquake, where you just sent money to every mobile device within a certain radius of the epicenter. And those are the kind of quicker, cheaper ways that may be worthwhile. One thing I did want to say very quickly, which is almost too obvious to say on the resilience question, which is if you're going to reuse the infrastructure for cash transfers for anything else, it needs to be reusable. Which means you either need to invest upfront in it, which is very hard given the current funding landscape, or you need to have enough time in the program planning to build something reusable. And I think what we've been seeing is too often than not, you wind up signing that final contract days before the money needs to flow, if not weeks, maybe, if you're lucky. That's just not a lot of time to build something reusable. So what we do often is just get the money out there as quickly as possible. And I think we're losing a real opportunity to reuse some of the rails and pipes that we would be building for other programs.
Anybody else on the panel want to pick up that point about how do you find the right people to give the cash transfers to? Rachel, you're nodding? Yeah.
I can have a quick go at it. I mean, I think the first thing is that I'd agree with Michael that this is not a cash issue. It's the same for targeting in-kind transfers. But the thing that I'd say is that we tend to get very preoccupied with targeting, with not having inclusion errors, not including people in our programs that are not very, very poor or are not the most in need. And my view is that in a humanitarian setting, we perhaps should not worry about that quite so much, and we should worry more about our exclusion errors, the people that are not currently in our program but should be. So perhaps that means changing standards in some ways, perhaps, and focusing more on tackling exclusion errors and less on, spend less time worrying about the inclusion errors.
Thank you. Mudassar from Islamic Relief Worldwide asks, have there been studies done to calculate the inflation in local markets due to cash-based interventions? You know I'm coming to you for that question, don't you?
I'm not sure if I'm the best place to do that. For inflation to take place, it automatically means that you've injected too much cash into the system and the market can't respond, so the prices of goods go up. Our post-distribution data, again, I'm not trying to paint a rosy picture. These are facts. They're all available, has shown that actually prices have not gone up and there has been no inflation, at least in Somalia. I cannot say that in certain places where the markets are not as integrated that wouldn't have happened, like South Sudan, for instance. There are parts of South Sudan that I don't know if you can inject even a quarter of what we've injected in Somalia into without having some inflation. So I think in the Somalia context, we haven't seen that.
Okay, let's get some more questions from inside the room. Oh, quite a lot of hands going up. We haven't done the middle section, actually. Lady here, lady behind, and then lady in the front row there.
So my name is Ollie from Shivia, a charity in India. Sorry to go back to this point, and I'm delighted to hear that the evidence that people don't misuse the money and they spend it on productive purposes. But what are the checks or the mechanisms you put in place before you give people the money, and what do you what are the sort of criteria you use to monitor how the money's spent after? That's probably for Tegan.
Hi, it's Rachel Morton from UNICEF UK. My question is somewhat related to the former question. I work with corporate partners in UNICEF, so it's my role to secure funds from the private sector, and I know that you mentioned the private sector with regards to cash transfers. The difficulty with working with the private sector, and I would imagine maybe institutional donors as well, is the more that you obscure where the money is going, the more difficult it is to secure the funding. Often they want to restrict funds to a thematic area that relates to their business mission or something that they can talk about. And even in a normal sort of emergency scenario where we're not, giving cash transfers, but we're transferring cash to a UNICEF project office where they'll, work in their standard thematic areas, that's difficult because of the restrictions on reporting we can provide back to the donor. They like to be able to know exactly where the money's going and I guess tailor it to businesses. So how do we get around that with this solution, I guess, to humanitarian aid, but incorporating that into the way that donors like to fund things?
And lady in the front row on this side.
Good afternoon. My name is Joreen. I work for Care International. And this question is more for Dagan because she was talking about men before receiving money. So I was just wondering in terms of proportion, at least in the last 10 years since you're talking about Somalia, in particular, if you would have an idea of how much, what is the proportion of women and children who received money in case of women and children-headed households. And my second question for the entire panel would be, cash transfer seems to work today, but what for tomorrow? Because it still seems as a short type of response for cash for food, cash for work. But in terms of resilience, I'm not sure to see the link between what we're doing in humanitarian work and how it can be bridged to development or resilience of those populations receiving the money from an intervention. So I'm just wondering, what is the good for tomorrow for those populations?
Okay, great. Let's first of all, before this becomes the Deganali show, let's nothing wrong with that. No, absolutely. Ollie from Shiva, your question about what checks should be put in place. Let's broaden that out, if you don't mind, to get the views of the panel and what they considered when they compile the report. Owen, why don't you take that on? Actually, here's a microphone for you.
So I think this question of how we ensure that people spend the money on how we think they should spend it is, I find it quite challenging because we have quite a lot of good ex post evidence now that people don't spend the money on what people regard as antisocial things, alcohol, drugs, crime. And of course we do know that when we provide aid in kind, when we give people food, they can sell that food and spend that money on antisocial goods, and we have no way of monitoring or controlling that. And there's some evidence that people do that less when they receive money as cash transfers than when we give aid in kind. So there is a worry here that we're setting a higher standard for giving cash than we do for giving other aid. So we're, on the one hand, making our aid much less efficient because we're making choices for people that might not match their preferences for what they need. And at the same time, we're not buying ourselves actually any greater security of the kind we worry about. But I want to push back on the idea that it's our problem to tell people what they should spend the money on. These are people living in terrible circumstances with very little resources who are making smart choices about themselves and their family. And the idea that they are likely to go and spend that money on things that we don't think they should it seems frankly insulting to people. And so I would push back on the idea that we have to do or should be doing any kind of either ex post, ex ante assurance. I think it's perfectly fine to do some ex post monitoring and see what happened, because it does generate evidence that should give us assurances for the future that in most circumstances people do actually spend the money extremely well. So I think we should, I want to resist the idea that we need some kind of ex ante assurance about how people are going to spend the money. I think that's a bad idea. If I may, can I pick up also on the Save the Children question about how do we tell funders where the money has gone?
It's UNICEF, I think.
Oh, was it UNICEF? Sorry, I'm sorry, I misheard. I think the donors need a bit to. So one thing that is striking is how little information we have now about where humanitarian aid goes. Actually, it's been quite striking to us how impossible it's been to establish how much money does actually go as cash today. So it's not like we have fantastic tracking mechanisms for our existing supply of in-kind aid. With cash, and especially when we move to electronic cash, which increasingly is possible, actually there's much more possibility then of finding out exactly who has received the money. And you could also begin to find out if you're making debit card transfers, electronic payment transfers, you can find out where they spent the money and what on. So there should be no presumption that cash is less accountable than our existing. If you imagine a convoy of trucks with food aid going through checkpoint after checkpoint and being pilfered along the way, right? You have no idea where that's all going to. Cash, actually, you're much more likely to be able to deliver to the person you're trying to target it on, and you can find out something, at least afterwards, about what it was spent on. And if donors don't like that, and they don't like the fact that you're giving people money much more efficiently and helping them much more effectively, well, we need to educate them so they do like that, right? The idea that we should run the whole system inefficiently so that the donors feel happy that they've got a flag on a sack of food seems to me close to outrageous. So I think we can tell a compelling story to donors about where the money has been, how the money has been used effectively. And I think, and in some sense, we have the opposite problem, which is we don't fix this humanitarian system faster than we're fixing it now. There are going to be a lot of donors who wonder why they're putting money into it at all. And we're well short of the money we need to deal with current crises. So let's get the system working better so that donors can confidently put money into it.
Rachel's question was about private sector donors, but Klaus, let me extend that to government donors as well. Are they going to buy this idea of, oh yeah, we'll give cash, let people have cash, we don't know where it's going?
No, I think also public donors have a problem of visibility. I mean, politicians want to see something. And I had personally the problem in Ukraine, where we actually did provide a lot of cash in a very sort of discreet way, but the politicians, they wanted airplanes with a big European flag on it. So I also provided that, but it was not the most efficient way of actually dealing with it. So it's about having a robust discussion also with our politicians that, hello, don't go for visibility, think about what is actually the ultimate beneficiary's interest in getting, for example, cash. We have convinced, but it sounds almost like a propaganda war here. I mean, we have convinced quite a few agencies to put, for example, the little blue flag on the plastic cards. So you have to be agile and smart and opportunistic and say to the politician, okay, you get your little flag here, but please then stop and don't ask me to charter a big plane. I mean, with flags all over. On resilience, I mean, let's be frank. It's not cash that is the main vehicle for resilience. It is one of very many components, and for me, it is very important that the humanitarians make sure that they have a continuous dialogue with the development people, so that in a given area, the development actors are ready to step in when the crisis is sort of over or close to being over. Because the moment we pull the plug on the social safety net, there has to be something there. And cash is part of that, but it's mainly having a good programming done between the humanitarians and the development actors, because that's the only way where we can actually join the two operations.
Let's just pass the microphone to Degan. Let's pick up, Degan, with you on Jorene's question. It was quite a specific question, wasn't it? It was about the percentage of women and children as part of women-headed households who were given cash transfers in your experience in Somalia. And admittedly, this is 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, when we first started our 2003 cash transfer, the donor was very specific and said we are scared that there will be men out there who will spend it on antisocial behavior, so we want you to do only 100% targeting of women. We all thought that that was ludicrous, but we had to give evidence, and we didn't have that evidence. So we said, okay, we have to take this conditionality this time, but let's gather the evidence for the future. Of course, when we went to the field and started targeting and telling in a large community meeting, you men are not going to be registered and only your wives will be registered, of course, there was a lot of pushback. And one man, I remember to this day, said to me, how do you think that I can be so irresponsible that I will let my child starve and I will use this money on Mira? How dare you? He said that to me. How dare you believe that? So, of course,
what did you say?
I had to explain to him that this was very new. The donors didn't understand that you are a responsible man, that we are not trying to destroy the community harmony or the family harmony. You will still have decision making in how that money is spent, and we will work with the donor to influence them so that next time we come back, we register you or your wife. It doesn't matter. It's based on what the community decides. Of course, we registered all of these women, and in the end, the woman, when we went back and we said, how involved were your men, your husbands, in the decisions of spending the cash? Almost every woman said that our men were involved. But what we did see was that it was creating conflict in the household. We were actually contributing to potentially, if we continued that, to having protection problems. You see? Or shift to power, yeah. But, it could have led to domestic violence, or something else, or, divorce, which is almost as bad, so in a Somali context. So my point is that what we people think in New York or London is the right decision is not necessarily the right decision on the ground. And again, it's going back to Owen's challenge and what I was saying earlier. We have to stop thinking that we know better than people on the ground. We have to get away from that. That's so paternalistic, and frankly, I think it's also very racist. We wouldn't be having these conditionalities if this money was being distributed in Northern America or Europe. We wouldn't be. But automatically we think, oh, poor black people or Asian people somehow don't know what to do with their money. We have to stop that.
Thank you. Interesting point. Rachel, you wanted to make a point in response to this question here from Ali about checks being put on where the money goes. Who
Yeah,
goes to.
it follows up really nicely on what Dagan just said. I think if you ask people what they spend the money on, they know how to play the game. They know what to tell you. They know what donors and NGOs are looking for. If you ask people what they really spent the money on, if you can talk to them quietly, then quite often in my experience, for example in Lesotho, for example in Zimbabwe, for example in Malawi, in Ethiopia, people will tell you, yeah, we spent a bit of money on a little pot of beer. It's part of their daily practices in their lives. They're not spending any more than they would normally. They're often spending a bit less. But, to ask people to change social behaviours in their community strikes me as meddling with what people do. But the second thing is that when you ask people about why they do things like that, in Ethiopia, I remember once asking somebody about what they'd done with the money, and they said that they'd bought some beer, they'd bought a goat, and the woman had bought a fancy new scarf. And that meant that she could go to a funeral that she could not have otherwise gone to because she wasn't appropriately dressed and she didn't take any food or any beer. And because of the cash transfer, she'd done a whole bunch of things that we're good at sneering at here, but actually enabled her to re-engage with social life in the community that she lived in. And it was probably the smartest thing she could have done with her money, because aid agencies and NGOs are not people's first port of call when they're in trouble. It's the social network that they have around them. So it's really smart to make sure that you build that social network. And if sometimes you do that by buying some beer or buying some meat that you can't really afford or buying something nice to wear, then you've done the right thing.
Interesting. Just pass the microphone to Owen, if you would. We are rapidly now having to wind up. But I just want to make the point that when we started work on this with Wendy and the Secretariat here at ODI, we had a feeling it was going to be quite a challenging report. And I think certainly some of the questions we've heard today bear that out. So I want to give the opportunity to the panel chair, Owen, just 1 minute, 1 minute.
1 minute.
Just to wrap up, give us your thoughts about, the report, where you hope it will go from here, and, some of the things you've heard here today.
Thanks, Rajesh. So we have a World Humanitarian Summit next year, Istanbul, May 2016. And that is the first ever World Humanitarian Summit. It is probably a once-in-a-generation lifetime to really bring about significant change in the humanitarian system. And we spent a lot of time as a panel not so much thinking about the basic conclusion, do we want to see more use of cash? Yes, we do. Not really debating the evidence, which is so compelling for the cash transfers that have been tried, of how well it works, but asking ourselves how we can bring about faster change in the humanitarian system. Because for a lot of the reasons that people have talked about, that the constraints of what donors want to see, the institutional constraints, the mismatch of skills, the mismatch of mandates, right down to kind of racism and paternalistic assumptions in the global north about what poor people will do with money. The question we struggled with, and I think we still struggle with, is how we really drive change through the system. And I think in the report we've come up with recommendations which, if implemented, will change the incentives, will mean that organizations will have opportunities to switch to cash, and will actually lead both NGOs, international agencies, the private sector to work together to find ways to do this. I don't think it's enough just to say we're going to spend a small amount of cash in every situation because we want to check whether it works and learn from that. I think we should do that, but I think we should do much more than that. We should go far beyond that. The key thing for me is to change the presumption. We hear a lot of requirement on those who advocate cash to explain, how do you know the market will respond? How do you know people will spend the money well? Right? Actually, the presumption should be the other way around. What makes you think the market won't respond? What makes you think people won't spend the money wisely? Why should the people who advocate cash be the ones who have to explain why we don't want to give people the choice about where the money goes? Actually, so for me, the key recommendation 1, why not cash, and if not now, when, is about shifting the presumption so that, yes, of course, there will be circumstances where cash isn't right, but let's analyze markets, let's analyze the circumstances, make that case where necessary, and fund the provision of services or of necessary vouchers or conditions. But the people who would do that need to explain why that's necessary in those circumstances. If not, we should default to giving people real choice, real dignity, restore to them agency over their lives. And as Rachel's pointed out, they're very smart about what's going to work for them, what's going to rebuild their network, what's going to enable them to feed their children. Let's give them that choice. And I'd love to hear from the audience here and listening out on the live stream. How can we make sure that the system makes this change between now and the World Humanitarian Summit next year? Thanks, Richard.
Sadly, you can't hear from them right now, because we have to wind up. Thank you, Owen. Sorry to anyone who didn't get their question asked or answered in the room, and thank you for everyone watching on the live stream. Thank you to all our speakers for a very interesting, thought-provoking session today. One last thought. There must be a better way to help the world's poorest and most vulnerable. This report from the high-level panel on cash transfers thinks that in many cases, cash is it. We've heard the evidence, we've heard that we have the technology. So what are we waiting for? Please take the report with you if you're here in the room. You can read it online. It's at odi.org and at cgdev.org. Thank you very much to ODI for the leadership on this report and for the venue and for organising this panel today. Thank you, speakers, and thank you all very much for joining us. Good afternoon.